So welcome back to the Common Constitutionalist weekly video podcast, and I am out on location in a remote location, out of state, out of town, whatever. And let's talk today about gun control, one of my favorite topics. Immigration and gun control, two of my favorite topics. Well, I'm going to leave immigration alone, and we're just going to discuss gun control, obviously due to the latest mass shooting in Las Vegas, and some interesting discussions I've had with some people. So we're going to do that today on the Common Constitutionalist.
Listening to the Common Constitutionalist, broadcasting from an undisclosed location, free from the prying eyes of establishment black helicopters.
Well, looky here, or don't looky here. You may notice that the video is gone, and this is strictly audio now. Well, turns out that about 2 minutes after I finished that opening monologue, for want of a better term, my camera gave out on me. And unfortunately, since I'm not Fox News or some other big place, I couldn't just call somebody and say, hey, bring me another camera. So the rest of this is going to be audio only, just like the old days. So we might as well just get into this. And today, yeah, we're going to talk gun control and whatnot, but I've decided to veer off a little bit from the opener and discuss how we conservatives can better educate the public and how we can fight the arguments of the left for gun control. And when you get right down to it, it's not really that difficult, assuming you have the ammunition, pardon the pun, to do so, to fight the left with their, you need some logic, you need some reason, you need some facts and figures, but you don't want to get bogged down in too many facts and figures, numbers and whatnot, because people have a tendency to just glaze over. So let's get right into this with, hey, some facts and figures. So the reason why the left, or at least the left who's the public left, the politicians and well, maybe not even the Hollywood crowd, because they're just dumber than fence posts, most of those guys in Hollywood. They just put out platitudes. They have no idea what they're talking about. Some of these people, like Michael Moore, actually do know what they're talking. As ridiculous as they sound, I think they're intelligent enough to know that what they're putting out is a bunch of crap. And as long as the public buys it, it doesn't matter what kind of crap it is. Same with the politicians like Schumer and Pelosi and whatnot. Which is why they talk about gun violence and gun deaths. Because if they started if they started breaking it out and itemizing it, then it wouldn't look to be. I mean, sure, it's tragic, but it ain't gun violence, and it's not homicides, and it's not mass killings and stuff. The fact is that suicide is the second most common cause of death for Americans between the ages of 15 and 34, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Across all ages, it's the 10th most common cause of death and caused 1.6% of all deaths in 2012, which is the latest data I could find. Pretty old, but, it's still fairly recent. Now, in 2010, there were 19,392 firearm-related suicides in the U.S., and the U.S. Department of Justice reports that approximately 60% of all adult firearm deaths are by suicide. In terms of both raw numbers and population rate, gun suicides have been on the rise in recent years, even as gun homicides have been falling. In 2010, the gun suicide rate was 6.3 per 100,000 people, compared with 3.6 per 100,000 people of gun homicides. And the public is wholly unaware of these facts and figures, so you got to at least throw them out there, maybe with a little additional explanation. But in fact, that the gun homicide rate in this country peaked in 1993, and it's gone down 49% since then. But you'd never hear this from the left because it doesn't suit their argument or the agenda for gun confiscation, which is exactly what they want. All right, so now you got the suicides versus the homicide. Not that suicide is a good thing, but it's a personal decision. It's not being thrust upon you necessarily. So, I mean, that's just I don't mean to be callous about it, but it just is what it is. All right, gun-free zones. How about that? Let's all have gun. If everything was a gun-free zone, we would have no problems. Wrong-a-rooney. Economist John Lott found that since at least 1950, all but 2 public mass shootings in America have been taking place where citizens are banned from carrying guns. In Europe, there have been no exceptions. Every mass public shooting, and there have been many in mass shootings in Europe, don't be fooled by that, have occurred in gun-free zones. So we have gun-free zones, they don't work. The suicide rate is well above the homicide rate, so it's not as big an issue as everybody makes it out to be, which is why they veil this thing in gun deaths and gun violence. Because they're lumping the suicide deaths in with the homicide, anything to make it sound worse than it actually is. Not that it, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not being that way. I care about these people. Nobody wants anyone else to be shot. I mean, any innocent person to be shot. Sorry about that. So what's next? Because obviously gun-free zones aren't working. Well, Democrat Senate Majority Leader Schumer said on the floor of the Senate, and this is just, it's laughable, kind of. Democrat Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said on the floor of the Senate that the way to stop mass shootings, here we go, is that they should pass laws that would keep guns out of the wrong hands. Well, how in the heck are you going to do that? I mean, the thing is that all these laws, they keep the guns out of the right hands, the law-abiding people. That's what laws are for. Laws are only followed by the law-abiding. That's what makes criminals criminals. I explained this to one of my relatives over the weekend, that this is what makes criminals criminals, because by default they don't follow the law. That's what makes them criminals. They don't follow the law, whether it be a traffic sign, a stop sign, or whatever it happens to be, or a gun law. Or what's the difference? That's what makes them a criminal. So these gun laws, none of these gun laws are going to keep guns out of the wrong hands, because the wrong hands are going to get them on the black market no matter what. So that's just a ridiculous argument. But this argument was not for our consumption. You have to understand that we're not the people that he's targeting. We're not the people that he's talking to. And many conservatives have taken to the airways after Schumer said this, that it's the most ridiculous statement that they've ever heard, and that it's laughable. Well, it isn't laughable because, like I said, this isn't for our consumption. This isn't for conservatives who actually think about this stuff. This is for emotion-based liberals. But to us, it just sounds so dumb. But it's not dumb. And Schumer may be a lot of things. He may be evil incarnate. I don't know about that. But he may be an evil guy. But he ain't stupid. And he knows how ridiculous, if he was to actually admit this, how ridiculous the soundbite sounds. But again, like I said, it ain't for our consumption. He's putting out just another soundbite, a drum beat that people can repeat and repeat and repeat. It's just a mindless soundbite to repeat. And I hypothesize, for want of a better term, that Schumer, he knows the Constitution. He may play whatever, populist or, liberal populist, if you can call it that, and leftist, and he talks about the Constitution in derogatory terms, not directly, but indirectly implies it. He knows the Constitution. He may hate it, but he understands it. And he also knows that the only way to disarm the people, the only way to get to the gun-free utopia of the left, is by confiscation. Gun laws ain't going to do it. Nothing's going to do it. It's confiscation, which is why they always bring up the great Australian buyback. The gun buyback that got rid of all the guns in Australia, which it didn't, of course, but that it was a voluntary program. Well, it wasn't voluntary, by the way. If you look into it, it started out voluntary, just like a lot of our laws start out as suggestions by the government. They want to give people a chance to voluntarily comply before they hit you over the head with a hammer and say that you must comply. Well, the Australian gun buyback was the exact same thing. You must comply or else. But of course, it was also easier for them because they don't have a constitution with a Second Amendment. And we do. And the left knows that, and that's their problem. They know that they can write about it, they can give speeches, they can go on these talk shows, they can do whatever they like to try to confiscate as many of these weapons as possible, try to chew up around the edges, try to chip away around the edges, and ban some guns and ban these things like bump stocks and all that. A lot of good that's going to do. But when the rubber meets the road, they know that changing the Constitution, it's heady and it's burdensome, and so it's dang near impossible to do. And unfortunately, from speaking to people that I know and respect and love, not many people actually know of the constitutional amendment process, which is another thing that we on the right, if you're to argue this, you need to argue that point too. And I've actually had to very, very recently, within the past few days, express or explain the amendment process to the Constitution, the two ways that it can be amended. So let's go through that real quick. Actually, we're going to take a break, and we're going to go through that right after the break. So I'll be right back. You're listening to me, the Common Constitutionalist.
Yeah, baby! Yeah.
So the amendment process. The first way to do it is through the Federalist way, for want of a better term, which you use the federal government to amend the Constitution. And for 17 previous times, that's the only way it's been done. So anyone can propose a constitutional amendment, but in order for it to be legally recognized, for want of a better term, it has to be proposed by the U.S. Congress. Just like the laws have to start in Congress, a proposed constitutional amendment has to start in the Congress. They have to get a two-thirds majority in both the House and the Senate in order to pass it. Now, unlike laws and whatnot, the president doesn't need to sign it. There's no requirement. The presidents do sign these amendments, but it's strictly for, show, for want of a better term. And why? And again, these are some of these fun facts that you need to put out to people to argue the point. And so why doesn't the president need to sign these? There's no requirement for the president. He also can't veto it. And the point about it is that in order to override a veto, what do you need? You need a two-thirds majority of both houses to override the veto. Well, in order to get a constitutional amendment, you already need two-thirds of both houses to pass the amendment. So what would be the point of the veto? It's a moot point because two-thirds have already voted for the constitutional amendment. I'll say, okay, so assuming you could do that, and you probably could never even get that far with a constitutional amendment, certainly like this, like changing the Second Amendment, that would be ridiculous. But that's the cry, that's the hue and cry of the left, is it's got to be changed, or like Michael Moore, we have to rescind or get rid of the Second Amendment. Well, he knows what a ridiculous statement that is, but it sounds good, or at least sounds good to the rabid left. All right, so you get through these the two-thirds majority in both houses, the Congress and the Senate, and then it has to go to the states. Well, 3/4 of the states have to be able to ratify that, have to ratify the constitutional amendment for it to become an amendment, or for it somehow to change one of the amendments. And that would mean only 13 of 50 states would have to vote no in order to kill the amendment. And it would be that simple. And so the left knows there is no way on heaven or earth at this point in time that they're going to ever be able to do that. And so that's why they're chipping away around the edges with every mass shooting or every kind of tragedy, mass tragedy that happens involving a gun, they chip away just a little bit more. Assault weapons, bump stock, whatever happens to be the cause du jour that they've come up with, or whatever happens to, whatever the shooter was using at the particular time, that's what they're going to chip away at because they know that's the only shot they've got. Okay, so the other way of changing the Constitution, and again, you need to know this stuff in case it ever comes up, in case you're ever arguing with a leftist, just either personally in a group or whatever. You need to be able to educate these people on exactly how this stuff has to be done legally, whether they like it or not. This is when the rubber meets the road. This is how it has to be done. And the other one is what we've been advocating for a long time now, is the Article 5 Convention of States, where the states actually introduce a constitutional amendment, and the federal legislature, the president, the Congress, the Senate have absolutely nothing to do with it. They can't say boo. They can't say yes. They can't say no. They have no veto power. They've got no input. They've got no nothing. It's left to the states and the states alone. In order just to even bring up an amendment, to propose an amendment, 2/3 of the states have to be on board just in order to begin a convention of states, not an individual amendment, but in order to convene a convention of states. 2/3 of the states have to agree to it. And in order to ratify any amendment that's put up, 3/4 of the states, again, the same thing with the other ratification process, 3/4 of the states have to agree. And again, that's a darn near impossible task. But, it could happen. But more than not, if a convention of states were to begin, if we were able to get the 2/3 necessary to convene a convention of states, more positive than negative could come out of this. There's almost no downside to it. But in any rate, because that's why it requires such a humongous group in order just to convene the convention of states, not even to ratify. 3/4 of the states have to ratify every single thing that comes out of the convention. Darn near impossible to do. And again, that's something that has to be stressed by, if you're trying to make an argument for the Convention of States. People are terrified that the federal government wouldn't be involved as a moderator even, or anything like that. Well, you need to let these people know that in order to get 3/4 of the states on board to ratify anything, it's darn near impossible, so fear not. Okay, so our argument has gone from, or has touched upon, gun violence, like suicides versus homicides, gun-free zones, how ineffective they are, changing the Constitution, getting rid of the Second Amendment, how difficult it would be, and how the left knows it. And so the next thing to do is we need to explain what the Second Amendment means, what that right to keep and bear arms actually means, because it does actually mean something, and they didn't just make it up out of whole cloth. So we'll take a quick break, and I'll explain that after the break.
You're listening to The Common Constitutionalist. Let the truth be known.
All right, welcome back. Now, like I said, finally, if we're to educate the ignorant, and ignorant is just a lack of knowledge. It has a negative connotation, and it shouldn't, because being ignorant is okay. I mean, it's just because you just haven't been taught or taught properly. You're just ignorant. Not stupid, but ignorant. But we need to explain what the term keep and bear arms is, because nobody uses those terms to keep and bear anything in context anymore. They just don't use those types of terms. So the first state declaration of rights to use the term bear arms was Pennsylvania in 1776. that the people, this is a quote from the Declaration of Rights, the Pennsylvania State Declaration of Rights from 1776, quote, that the people have a right to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state, unquote. So that's pretty clear, no ambiguity at all. Assuming you know what the right, what bear means. Like it ain't a bear in the woods. So John Adams, most people know John Adams. He was a founding father, second president of the United States, all that happy crap. He wrote of the right to keep and bear arms, that arms in the hands, a quote, arms in the hands of citizens to be used at individual discretion in private self-defense. Again, there's an explanation directly by one of our founders, and it's pretty bloody clear. Again, no ambiguity. And some of these things I've actually lifted from several articles I've done on gun control and the Second Amendment, of which there have been plenty. So in 1789, mere days after James Madison proposed the Bill of Rights, what we read of in the Constitution, the first 10 amendments, which is the Bill of Rights, a guy by the name of Tench Coxe, he was a friend and correspondent of both James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. He wrote that the Second Amendment would confirm to the people, quote, their right to keep and bear their private arms, unquote. And interestingly, that he wrote both Madison and Jefferson this, and neither man sought fit to correct Mr. Coxe, that it was only supposed to be within the militia, because obviously it wasn't. And so this stuff is plain as day if you actually go back and research it, what these guys knew of. Heck, Thomas Jefferson carried a couple of pocket pistols, concealed carried weapons, and he carried them everywhere he went. And he didn't need a permit because the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, period. It doesn't say anything about the right to open carry or the right to concealed carry or the right to any other bloody thing. It's the right to keep and bear arms. So what do those two terms mean, to keep and to bear arms? Well, for that, we go back to Webster. You know Webster's dictionary? Well, Webster's dictionary was Noah Webster, who was a founding father and he was a prominent Federalist back in the day, so to speak. And since he was a wordsmith, Webster's dictionary, he could explain what to bear arms is pretty good, probably better than anyone else. So we all know to keep is just to own or to have, okay? So that's pretty easy. We still use that term. Bear arms, no one uses that anymore, except in the context of the Constitution. So Webster wrote the first major pamphlet in support of the Constitution when it was proposed in 1787. And he stated that, quote, before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every kingdom in Europe. Funny how nothing's changed in Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because the whole body of the people are armed. And once again, no ambiguity, clear as a bell. So what does to bear mean? Well, in fact, Webster's famous dictionary, that was first published in 1828, defines bear as to wear, to bear a mark of authority or distinction, as to bear a sword, a badge, a name, to bear arms and a coat. Continuing to the word arms, and this was all from Webster's original dictionary in 1828. Continuing to the word arms, weapons of offense or armor of defense and protection of the body. So according to Webster, to bear arms is to carry or wear weapons openly or concealed. And there's no difference. They never made any difference. They never made any distinction between open carry and concealed carry. So to keep and bear arms, you can say quite adequately and quite accurately, is to basically own, to keep, and to carry, to bear a weapon for your own self-defense, according to the founders' words themselves. All right, so after the left loses that argument, to keep and bear arms, and if you were able to quote some of the founders, it's pretty simple what they meant by to keep and bear arms. what original intent means. So they'll and I've heard this on air over the weekend and over the past week. They say, well, if the right to bear arms is unrestricted, does that mean I should be able to own a tank or a nuclear weapon or artillery or other heavy weapons? What a ridiculous argument. But if you're not prepared, then you're going to be doing this humming thing and having to think about it. Well, the answer is clearly no, obviously, because the Second Amendment gives you the right to keep, own, or have, and bear, to carry a weapon. You're going to be able to carry a tank or a piece of artillery or other heavy weaponry? No, you're not. It's for personal protection and for private self-defense. So to bear arms, it doesn't mean you can own a tank or whatever, because you certainly couldn't carry one around, and you can't carry a piece of artillery, or, it would be difficult even to carry mortars around. So that's the next thing that they would say. Well, and I've heard this too, just recently, just over this past week. Well, if you can't carry a tank or blah, 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 what about grenades and bombs and bazookas and crap like that? Yeah, sure, they could be carried, but these aren't they're not for private self-defense. And you can see very specifically that the founders said in defense of yourself, for self-defense. And these aren't defensive weapons. These weapons are more likely to create they will create collateral damage to not only the guilty or the aggressor, but to innocent bystanders. So this isn't just for self-defense. This is an aggressive weapon. So it's not like Adam says, for private self-defense, because it goes beyond the scope of self-defense. So ergo, bombs and bazookas and grenades and crap like that are not, they're not contained under the Second Amendment. Sorry, folks. That's just the way it is. And finally, to wrap this thing up, there's the question of registering your weapon and the question of an actual license to carry, which I thought is the most ridiculous thing in the world. And it's why I am very proud of the governor and the legislature in New Hampshire. We've always had the right to open carry in this state, and I always open carry. Everywhere I go, I carry my firearm for all to plainly see. And I'm not going to bother to get into, again, why I do what I do. Maybe at another time I'll go through it. I've already been through it several times here, and I think in podcasts and in articles. But just to make you get a license to carry is an infringement of your Second Amendment rights. And Senator Ted Cruz several years ago described it as well as it could be described. He says, quote, "Would one need to register or obtain a license to exercise their religious or political beliefs or free association such as the First Amendment delineates? Wouldn't you think it absurd to require a permit before objecting to unreasonable search or seizure?" And he's right. The bottom line is an infringement of an amendment is an infringement of any amendment. It doesn't make any difference. It's just an infringement. It doesn't matter what amendment it infringes upon. One is equal to the other. And without the Second Amendment, pretty soon we wouldn't even have a First Amendment, because that's the first thing that dictators and these oligarchs do, is they take away the people's guns so they know they can't fight back against their standing army or whatever. They can't fight back. And so that's the first thing they do, is disarm, and then they can take away your other rights. But it all starts with the Second Amendment, and that's why the Second Amendment is so important. So this is the Common Constitutionalist. I hope this has been helpful for if you were to get into a discussion, hopefully an agreeable, or you can disagree without being disagreeable, obviously. Keep your head, keep your cool when you're arguing these points with liberals. An argument doesn't have to be argumentative. But try to remember these points, and you're guaranteed to win every argument. Worst the case that's going to happen is they just give up and walk away because they know they've lost. So this is a Common Constitutionalist signing off. We'll see. I'll get my camera back up and running. We'll have a video podcast God willing, and the creek don't rise. Speaking of which, I wish all the people locked down in Biloxi, Mississippi, in those areas. And we'll talk to you next week.